Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK Spring Playoffs Semifinals Overview and Analysis video. We are here, the top 3 teams. We know one of the teams from the LCK that will be heading to the finals, to MSI, of course, in Gen G, but who will be joining them? That we will figure out here today. The number 2 and number 3 teams in the league going head-to-head, at least in terms of seeding, in terms of how the playoffs have progressed, to see who can have an opportunity to potentially avenge some of their losses over the course of this year against Gen G. These two teams have played against each other, and I'm really excited to see if the outcome will be the same or if it will be different from earlier on in the playoffs. Of course, let me know what you guys were expecting down in the comment section below. Did this series live up to your expectations? Was it as fun as you guys expected it to be? Were the games as interesting as you expected them to be, or was it a little bit surprising? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on what I expected to see out of this series, not only can you check out the round number 3 video up in the iCard right now, that's going to be the previous round, but you can also check out the LCK playlist up in the iCard. That's going to be every single regular season week recapped on this channel, as well as every single playoff round recapped on this channel. So you can go back to the round number 1 video if you want a full breakdown of HLE versus T1, you know, because that was the first time that we had to preview a matchup between these two teams. And then, of course, you can also check out any of their regular season matchups if you are interested at all. But today, what we are going to be doing, if you are new to the channel, is we're going to go game by game in the semifinals, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in the series, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be previewing the finals at the end of this episode, but for the most part today is going to be spent talking about the semifinals and what happened on the Rift. So without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. Of course, it's all one series here today, only one best of 5 to go over, and that is the lower bracket finals, the semifinals, however you want to classify it, between the number 3 seeded Hanwha Life Esports and the number 2 seeded T1. The reason I say it in that order, with T1 being the higher seed, is because, of course, the last time these two teams played earlier on in the playoffs, HLE was able to win it, and they were able to win it very confidently. This was not a particularly close series when these two teams faced off earlier on in the playoffs, with a 3-0 clean sweep coming in. And that gave them a ton of momentum. They then went on to take on Gen G. Of course, they weren't able to get over the hump that was Gen G, but they put up a pretty good fight. T1, to their credit, doing everything they needed to do in that 4th place game against D+ Kia in order to get to this spot. But really, all of that goes out the window. These two teams are probably the two most evenly matched teams in the entire league in terms of skill level. I think there's a reason HLE was able to dominate that previous series, even when you take out some of the off-the-rift stuff that was going on with T1. Of course, that was a big topic of conversation. It obviously matters. I've talked about that a lot. I think that the concerns are very valid that, oh, maybe that series only went the way that it did because, you know, they didn't get a chance to play solo queue. They haven't really been practicing because of all these DDoS attacks. And of course, that does play into your mental as well as a player. So I understand that there was definitely some weird stuff going on there for T1. However, it's not entirely surprising to see a team like Hanwha Life Esports genuinely perform so well in a series like that. I think that's the part that I'm not shocked on. It's not that, oh, I'm shocked that T1 is bad. It's more so HLE, I just think, is a really genuinely good team, a team that at times can be considered a top 5 team in the entire world. I think that's a very valid thing to say for HLE. I think when you go down the line, there are a lot of reasons to like Hanwha Life in a matchup like this. I think their bot lane has been significantly better over the course of this year. Viper and Delight, I think you could make a strong argument, have been the best bot lane in the LCK in 2024. Whether or not that's going to carry over into a big series, I think we'll have to see. I trust them, because Viper, obviously a player who's won Worlds in the past, a player who has stepped up big time in the past for a team at Edward Gaming that really relied on him. And then Delight has kind of been known very early on in his career as a playoff performer, somebody who steps up his performances when the games matter the most. He was awesome at Worlds last year. I think you could make an argument that Jungle is also very Hanwha Life favored. You're looking at Peanut versus Owner. I think Peanut is just, quite frankly, the better player on almost every level across this year so far. I'm pretty out on Owner as an individual player. I think he has been, I'm not going to say the weakness of T1, because I don't think he's actively losing games for the team like he was at times last year, but he has really not been a strength for them. He has relied a lot on the rest of his team being able to generate their own individual leads. He's not been nearly as aggressive and not been nearly as tempo-oriented, and I think a player like Peanut could potentially be able to take advantage of that, and those were things that we saw in the previous series, which is why I point them in the direction of Hanwha Life. The solo lanes is really where you look at T1 and say, this is where you should be able to generate your leads. Specifically, mid lane Faker is amazing, and you would expect him, especially in these big moments, to be able to step up and to be able to be a driving force for what T1 wants to do. But it's worth noting Zeka has also been very good across this year. It's not like Zeka's had a bad year by any stretch of the imagination. You know, Faker and Zeka were second and third in my MVP voting in the regular season, so both of them stepping up and being important pieces to their team. Faker did come in at second, though, and so I would generally say that he has the advantage in terms of especially consistency in this mid lane matchup and what I would expect on a game-to-game basis. And then you get to the top lane. This is where it becomes a lot more interesting, because Zeus was definitely better than Doran in the regular season, but Doran, very similar to what we talked about with Delight, is a player that seemingly always gets better in the playoffs, and more specifically just knows how to beat Zeus. It feels so ridiculously comfortable for him to be able to constantly win lane and transition that into solid leads in the mid game, and essentially take Zeus out of games every single time these two players go head-to-head in a best-of-5, whether it was on Gen.G or now here on Hanwha Life, as we saw in the previous series. Doran played his best games of the year in that series against T1, and so there is some concern for T1 fans that potentially there are just players on this team that have their number, that understand how to beat these individual players, regardless of whether or not you would consider them better or not. But T1 is definitely going to have a point to prove in this series. Losing in that previous one, especially 3-0 with everything going on, I think they want to avenge that heavily. So can Hanwha Life continue on with where they left off in that previous series, or is T1 going to show that things are a bit different now and they've regained a lot of that confidence? Well, of course, going game by game means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to carry over that success that they had in the previous series to the first game, the start of this series. And you know, you can sit here and say, like, congratulations to Hanwha Life, but at the end of the day, how is it possible that they won this game? This is the biggest comeback I think I can remember in especially a pivotal game in League of Legends that, at least in the last 5 to 6 years, they were down 11 to 12k gold in this game. I mean, truly, this was over. It was completely and utterly over. There should have been absolutely no opportunity for them to even remotely play this game out from even like 5 to 10 minutes onwards. This should have been done and dusted. But mistake after mistake after mistake from T1 allowed HLE to get back into this game, and eventually the best players in the game ended up emerging, that being Viper and Delight in the bot lane for Hanwha Life, and they were able to kind of push them over the top. We'll give a lot of credit to a couple of other members of this team, but for Hanwha going down 11 to 12k gold and still being able to come back and win this, what a confidence booster, what a momentum grabber for T1, who's not been able to beat Hanwha Life in the playoffs so far. They lost to them in the final series of the regular season as well, at least the final series that these two played against each other. Like, this is earth-shattering. This is a disaster for you individually as a team. I mean, if you weren't questioning whether or not you could beat these players before, you're certainly questioning it now, because this almost feels like fate that you lost this game. This felt completely and utterly unlosable for T1, and yet somehow, some way, they ended up losing this game. I think there are still a lot of positives to take away from this, because they did get an 11 to 12k gold lead in this game, and that's not easy to do against a team like Hanwha Life, but the fact that you threw it away is so disappointing, and certainly does raise some questions for the rest of this series. But let's talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Viper in the bot lane. There's just nobody else that this could go to. His team fighting in the back half of this game was literally game winning for HLE. I think if you don't have Viper, if you don't have Delight in this game, there is just a 0% chance that this game goes in favor of HLE, because we'll talk about the solo laners in just a second, but man, they had some rough games early on, and we were talking about for T1, the advantages that they could potentially grab in this series should theoretically be through the solo lanes, and that's exactly what they did, but unfortunately, the bot lane ended up bailing out HLE. Credit to Viper, he really knows exactly how to play all these champions in the late game. He is such a consistent team fighter. It's something we've talked about as a benefit to HLE all year long, is that players like Zeka and even Doran to an extent can be pretty volatile. Even Peanut to a relative extent can be kind of volatile, can have bad games here or there, but you can rely on Viper in particular to be that carry in the late game with or without resources in the early game. It really is so consistent how relevant he is able to be in a lot of these performances, and this is a great example of why Viper, in a lot of people's opinion, is the best AD carry in the world, because it doesn't really matter what happens throughout a majority of the game. He's always going to be able to pull something back, and it really shouldn't have been possible, but he was excellent here. Delight was also excellent. I really think his contributions to this game are going to go a bit under the radar, because he wasn't quite as flashy, he wasn't doing as much damage or anything like that as even the Sejuani or the Varus, obviously, but he was still excellent in the late game. a ton of problems in the early game in terms of the passiveness that he was showing on Rel. Typically speaking, I'm a big proponent of just playing super aggro on Rel, especially when you've got something like a Yone Sedge as your mid-jungle duo, because you have this opportunity to potentially snowball the game out of control, but HLE really fell behind very early in terms of tempo. I understand why Rel wasn't going for a lot of engages. The problem is that champion typically doesn't have a lot to do from behind, fortunately, and I know I keep switching it up. Delight is really good, and he steps up his performances a lot in the playoffs, and so Viper and Delight ended up being very relevant in the late game anyways, but this should not have been an easy performance from either of these two champions, and yet they made it look like it was very possible and very easy. Peanut, I thought, was also relatively fine this game, but man, the solo laners got run over. I'm doing the rare thing where dud of the game is going to go to the winning team in the playoffs. I don't think I've done this in a very long time, but dud of the game is going to go to Doran. Whether you want to give this to Doran or Zeka, I think it has to be one of those two. This game shouldn't have been winnable for HLE, and a big reason why is because the solo laners just did not play well at all. In game number 1, Doran had a pretty miserable game on a K'Sante pick that continues to lower and lower itself in terms of my priority list. I used to think that there was really no reason not to pick K'Sante in a lot of these games because he does offer a bit of everything. He can play weak side, he can play strong side, he can play for early game, he can play for late game. He kind of just does a little bit of everything. He certainly doesn't need resources in order to be relevant, but we continuously see a lot of these more macro-oriented pieces just pull K'Sante away from a lot of the things that he's good at and end up turning him into just like a relatively okay bruiser, something that is a lot more akin to like what Renekton offers at a top level than, you know, what you would expect from the best top laner in the game. Not that Renekton is bad by any means, just that, you know, K'Sante is certainly counterable, and Doran really showed that in this one. For a player who really knows Zeus's like ins and outs, there were a lot of mistakes in the laning phase. This is one of the worst laning phases I think Doran has had into Zeus in a long time. Now, we'll talk about Zeus in a second. He made some critical errors in the back half of this game, but Doran was also really bad and honestly should have lost this game, and the same thing goes for Zeka on the Yone. If you're going to pick something important like that, you have to be able to dominate lane, or at the very least be relevant as you head into these mid-game skirmishes. The problem is, going into something like Taliyah, Faker had pressure and prio constantly throughout the laning phase and was just able to move around the map, and Zeka was really never able to make up for that, to capitalize in any sort of meaningful way, and so he ended up falling really far behind. But again, they both were bailed out by the bot lane in particular, and HLE is going to feel super lucky to walk out of this with a win, and T1 just has to feel completely hard done. Like, they did it to themselves. I'm not trying to sit here and say that, oh, they got unlucky or anything. There was obviously some luck involved in this, but to lose this game, like, you can't lose this game on accident. You can't lose an 11k gold lead on accident. It's not possible. You can't lose a game still being up a 1.5k gold after the Nexus is taken on accident. It doesn't happen, right? And so you do have to blame this team quite a bit. I think there obviously were good performances in the early game. Faker had a very good game in the early game. I think that there was a lot of good to talk about. Guma and Carry, I don't think were like major errors for this team. Hell, even Zeus and Owner, I think, had a really solid early game. You don't get this kind of giant, massive lead if you're not being proactive and making plays, but the critical errors down the stretch just ended up costing this team. I know a lot of people are going to look at that gold card in the final fight for Zeus where he essentially just wastes it, and, you know, that could have been a really useful priority thing to be able to try and pick off one of the primary carries for Hanwha Life, and eventually Zeus gets blown up and the game is just kind of over off of that. That's certainly disappointing, but I don't think Guma played these final fights particularly well, especially on a fed Zeri. Like, there was a lot that this champion can do to just 1v9 the game, as we've seen in previous splits, and Guma played it way too safe and ended up not doing nearly as much as the Varus on the other side of these matchups, which is, you know, horrible. That's not what the champion is for. Owner, I don't think, played any of these late game fights well at all. I should say relatively well at all. I think the Vi ended up being more of a negative than a positive. You know, I just don't think that there was a lot of good coming out from this team in the back half of the game. Their objective control was generally sloppy, even if it was fine for the most part. It just felt like a completely disorganized team. This does not feel like T1. This does not feel like the kind of cohesive unit, a group of 5 players that's played together for 3 straight years at this point. That's not what we saw on the Rift in this game. We saw a team that had absolutely no understanding of how to close out a game, and that is certainly terrifying. Again, the mental impact of losing this game cannot be understated. You have to win game number 2, in my opinion. If you lose this game number 1 in the way that you did and then go into game 2 and end up losing that, especially if you get blown out, I feel like your mental is completely crushed. And while there are players on this team that I think could survive that, like Faker, I'm expecting his mental to be fine. There are other players on this team that are notoriously kind of mental boomers, and so I really would not expect this to go well if they do not win game 2, but Hanwha Life can put a pretty commanding stamp on this series if they are able to take that second game. So what's going to happen? Is T1 going to be able to tie up the series, or is HLE going to be able to take that commanding lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1, they are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and like I said, this was essential. If you lost this game, I truly think that it's just over. Like, first of all, winning 3 games in a row against Hanwha Life is not going to be particularly easy. It's possible, but it's certainly not going to be simple, especially from down 2-0. But, I mean, the mental of losing game 1 and then losing game 2, I don't really see a way to come back from that. I wouldn't be able to. My mental would be completely drained, especially after what happened in the previous series, what's been happening to you off the Rift all week, all month long at this point for T1, but luckily for them, they were able to win this game too. I think this does stabilize a bit of this series. I do want to say, you know, typically speaking, I would sit here and I would rant and complain about this team comp from T1 because this is one of the most cancerous things I've ever seen in my entire life. Zac, Viego, Corki, Senna, Sejuani might be one of the least fun, least interactive team comps that you could ever draft in the history of League of Legends, but again, this was such a consequential game for them that I'm okay with them, at least in game number 2, saying, screw it. I don't really care if this is fun to watch. I don't really care if, you know, this is an interesting team comp. We just want to win the game. This is one of the few circumstances where I'm going to allow this to happen, but holy lord, this is like the least fun comp you could ever possibly draft. It is perma-lockdown. It's inevitable scaling in Corki, Senna, and Viego. It's just awful. Like, it is the definition of a comp that you would hate to play against in solo queue, but hey, it ended up working. I can't sit here and complain about it. It ended up working. For Hanwha Life on the other side, just a couple of minor errors that I think ended up costing them this game. They were in a relatively okay position for a bit of this. I think that there were a couple of players who did play well on the side of HLE, especially from a positioning or a mechanical perspective. I just don't think they had the firepower in terms of their team comp, and, you know, one major mistake I would say down the stretch of the game ended up costing them, even if that player, I think, had a relatively good game overall. So we'll go ahead and talk about it when we get to them, but for T1, player of the game pretty obviously has to go to Zeus. His proactivity when he actually is on these teamfight champions is just so different to when he is not on these. Like, the difference between watching him play Zac and watching him play Twisted Fate, he's clearly just a lot more comfortable with one playstyle than the other. Let him play Zac, let him play Aatrox, let him play these champions that are built more for these front-to-back 5v5s where he can be a primary engager, where he knows exactly the time to pull the trigger on some of these engages. It just fits his style, and it fits what T1 wants to do so much more. This laning phase was completely toxic and completely cancerous. I never want to see Rek'Sai versus Zac ever again for the rest of my life. However, congratulations to Zeus for being able to come out on top in that matchup. He played really well in this game. I don't want to sit here and try and, you know, shit on Zeus really at all. I thought he played well, and Zac is far from the champion that I'm the most upset by in terms of this team comp. I think it's just the composition in total, but I really like Zac. I think this is a pick that should be increasing in priority around the world. It's not really being picked or banned at the rate that I would expect it to be. I think it's probably the most consistent tank in the top lane. It does relatively well into things like Renekton, things like Rek'Sai that are going to be a bit more of the common picks that you're going to expect to see in a lot of these matchups, and so I'm honestly more surprised that it has not become more of a staple in the top lane. Zeus, I think, showing a lot of the power. I think teams sometimes worry about the lack of an early game, or at least the lack of a consistent, like, strong side of the map, especially in comparison to things like Rek'Sai. However, the team fighting potential that you get from Zac is just so much infinitely higher than it is for any of those other champions that I do think it merits some sort of, like, place in the meta, and Zeus definitely showing that off here. Also worth noting, Owner was awesome in this game, and I think this has become a bit of a common trend. Owner is pretty consistently done bad in the regular season and is just kind of better in the playoffs. I think this is closer to his actual skill level. That's kind of how I want to say it. Not that Peanut played poorly on the other side of this matchup. We will get to that. I thought Peanut had a pretty good Vi game, all things considered, but Owner was really good in this game on the Viego, especially in those fights when you have a Zac setting up for a Viego. It's really difficult to actually deal with that because you can't CC chain the Viego down. As soon as he starts getting these resets, all of a sudden these fights become a lot easier for T1 to win. It makes Corki and Senna's life a lot easier, and you have, like, infinite frontline here with Zac plus Sejuani, and so you're really never going to be concerned for any sort of, like, CC chaining or any sort of interruptions in these fights, and if Viego starts getting those resets again, everything just starts rolling. So credit to Zeus, credit to Owner. I thought they were the most important players in this game as both the carry and the initiator in terms of how these fights ended up going, but I think everybody was relatively fine in this game. Gumayusi was good, Keria was good. Faker, I think, certainly had his own problems on the Corki. Again, I want to reiterate, I think this champion is bad. I think it's very over-prioritized, and I think Faker played it a lot at the beginning of the year, and everyone just started copying him. Chovy played it a bit, and everyone started copying them, and all of a sudden now everybody wants to play Corki. I think this champion does almost nothing that you can't get out of other champions in a more consistent and in a better way, but if you're going to make it work, I guess you can make it work. I think we saw the flaws of Corki in this game, even when things were going well for T1. Faker was, in my opinion, by far the least consequential player, the least positive player for T1 in this game, and I don't think any of that can be attributed to him as a player. I think the champion just doesn't really do all that much, or it doesn't do nearly as much as maybe you would want it to, and you know, they ended up falling into that trap. But again, if you're going to go for this super boring, super late game, super, you know, I hate to use the term cancerous, but like there's really no other term for this group of 5. If you're going to go for this comp, at least you were able to pull it off. Like at least you were able to win the game. If you picked this and lost, devastating. But for HLE on the other side, you know, I think there were some good things that they tried in this game. They stayed relatively competitive for a lot of it. They just weren't able to actually make it work in the end. Dud of the game is going to go to Zeka, mostly for the one time he got caught out at the end of the game. I still want to reiterate, you're constantly seeing comments on Reddit and on Twitter and all of these things about, oh, this is what happens when you rely on Zeka to carry a game on Azir, or when you rely on Zeka to carry a game. Not only did he do it a bunch of times over the course of this year, he's won like 4 or 5 series on his own on Azir throughout 2024 by itself. It's his second best champion by my estimation, but I guess people just forget about the World Finals run where Azir was his most played champion at Worlds. Like he dominated on that pick. He has always been very good at Azir. The conversation has never been, oh, Zeka can't play anything other than melee carries. The conversation has been Zeka can't play anything other than melee carries except for Azir. Azir has always been a champion that he can carry games on, and so whatever this narrative is, again, I think it's just Reddit finding reasons to hate Zeka. I've talked about it so much. He is by far the most criticized player in the world for absolutely no reason, in my opinion, especially in comparison to his talent level. He gets treated like he's closer, and he is like so much better than players like closer, even a player like Cream. I think Zeka is just like an infinitely better version of that style of play. I get it, he's going to make a mistake down the stretch of this game that does end up costing HLE, but it's just, you got to live with the style. Like, there are other mid laners that make mistakes like this all the time that end up losing these games. I don't think he was infinitely worse than Faker was in this game. I just think that he did make that one error down the stretch. But there were positives for this team. Like I said, Peanut played really well on the Vi. Not a huge fan of this Vi pick. I don't think it really enables your primary carries, but you're really here to use it to set up for Azir in the late game. You're hoping to get onto the Corki or the Senna relatively efficiently. I just don't think you have enough peel. Perhaps something like a, you know, Sejuani early on in the draft could have been a bit more reliable. You had the opportunity to take it before T1 did, and you just didn't end up going for it, but I understand the idea behind Vi. It does give you a bit more offensive power, especially in the early game. And then Varus Rel continues to be a bit of a positive, I would say, for HLE. They didn't really have a lot to do this game because Senna Sedge is just such an unpunishable lane, but you know, Viper's build was also a bit of a problem. The Varus just didn't really have an opportunity to deal damage against Zac and Sedge as this game continued to go along. Doran, I think, also struggled a bit, but it really does feel like the pre-analysis that I did of this series in, you know, round 2, as well as, you know, before this series and, you know, last week's video, it all is kind of coming to fruition. It's the bot lane looking okay and jungle looking okay for Hanwha Life, but their solo laners just simply need to step up. Zeus and Faker have been good. Zeus in particular was really good in this game, and it's going to be interesting to see if that can carry over into the rest of the series, or if HLE is going to be able to bounce back. Tied up at 1 apiece means that Game 3, as you know, in my opinion, becomes the most important game in the series. Whoever wins this is going to have a ton of momentum. They only have to win one of the final 2 games, and it does put pressure and series point on the enemy. So a big game number 3 here. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was T1. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to take control of this series for the first time, and honestly, this should have been their 3-0. They should not have lost game number 1. They should have not have thrown that away. This should have been their clean sweep revenge series against Hanwha Life, and yet here we are. They're still up 2-1. They're still in a very good spot, but this was clearly the most dominant game of the series up until this point. They really controlled this from start to finish. Their mid to late game was significantly better than it had been really at any point in this series up until this, you know, game, I would say. And Hanwha Life, I think, really struggled in this one. Their flaws are starting to come out, and a lot of that pre-series analysis has really kind of turned out to be true. The solo lanes have just not been able to hold up. They've really not been able to be competitive in this series at all, and T1 has been able to take a lot of advantage of that. So we'll talk about it as we continue to go along. Player of the game for game 3 is very obviously going to go to Faker in the mid lane. Easily his best game of the series up until this point. I thought he was fine in game number 1, the game that they lost. He really was not the reason that they lost that at all. He was was pretty stable throughout the game and was doing a lot of good things on the Taliyah to continue to push them forward, but that Corki game just felt super lackluster. Again, I put a lot of that on the champion rather than the player because I just don't think Corki is, I guess, playable in a major capacity. Like, obviously, he's playable, he can do things, there's a reason he's still getting picked pretty regularly at the pro level, but I just think in comparison to other champions, he does so much less than a lot of the other meta champions that it's hard to keep up. But, you know, Faker on Azir, this is a pretty classic combination to just be able to win games. His laning phase was excellent. He really took out the Yone super early on. Hanwha Life clearly feels very confident in this Sedge plus Yone mid-jungle duo because they've gone to it multiple times in this series already, and I don't really understand it. Like, I get the idea behind it. I just don't think it's working. I think this full melee comp is not something that I would necessarily be trying out at this stage of the playoffs. It's not something that I would consider particularly meta. I think you're passing over some really strong picks in order to try and force it, and I think it's being punished really heavily, and Faker did probably the best job I've seen of punishing this kind of specific team comp style from Hanwha Life over the course of this playoff. So awesome game from him. He was basically perfect in terms of his decision making. We talk all the time about how LCK mids are just way more consistent in terms of knowing exactly where and when to go in on Azir. One of the big differences that you'll see from really good players to just good players on Azir is they don't fall for what I like to call LEC Azir syndrome, as I talk about it all the time in the LEC, where when you see like a good player get Azir, they're constantly going for Shuriman shuffles. They're really looking to be the primary initiator, the primary playmaker on a lot of different teams, whereas when you see the great Azirs end up getting this champion, they know when they need to be the primary initiator, and they also know when they can just sit at the back of their team and just auto attack and kill everybody. Like, it's got to be a good balance. You don't always need to go for the highlight play, and I think Faker understands that better than almost anybody. It's why he has dominated on this champion throughout the entirety of his career, but this was awesome. Certainly the better mid laner in this game. This was a pretty big mid gap, in my opinion. Then you can also talk about Owner having a really good series so far. The two Viego games, I think, have been really positive. I think this champion has been under-prioritized, and I know I say that about quite a few junglers, but, you know, we haven't seen a lot of the junglers that get over-prioritized. I think Vi has gotten over-prioritized. I think Xin Zhao has gotten over-prioritized. I think champions like Viego and the tanks like Sejuani and Maokai, I think, are incredibly undervalued in the current meta, and we're seeing that play out in terms of the win rates in the playoffs across every major region. Viego has been excellent. He really just kind of does everything. I know his numbers aren't as strong as they've been in previous years, but he still is such a mega pick. Like, he's inevitable in a lot of these games. If he gets those resets, he can take over any team fight, and he's good in the early game. He's good in the mid game. He can control objectives. He does a little bit of everything. He is kind of a jack of all trades, master of a few of them, and so he is going to be very valuable in a lot of different circumstances. Keria was good on the Orm. Typically, I'm pretty anti, like, Senna plus Orm. We've seen it in the past. It just kind of makes the Senna a lot weaker. Really, the only lanes that we've seen Senna work with in terms of the pro level consistently are mostly Tahm Kench. That's what's been the most consistent one, but even things like Maokai and Sejuani I think could be relatively effective because they do help the jungler out so much. Ornn could theoretically fill a similar role, but I think he does it in a very different way. I understand the idea behind it. It just hasn't necessarily been super successful in terms of the win rates at the pro level. This was a good example of how you can utilize it. He was absorbing every bit of CC on the enemy team, every single team fight, because they did not want to do Ornn ult, and so it really just opened up these opportunities for Faker to be a lot more active in terms of some of the aggressive plays he could go for, and I think Keria ended up being a positive in that way, even if it wasn't necessarily like the individual plays that he made. Just his presence alone, I think, helped the team out a lot. And then Guma, Zeus, they were both really good as well, but this was Faker's game. He was the carry, and he was definitely the better mid laner, which transitions nicely into HLE. I really don't like them forcing this Sedge plus Yone comp. I think in isolation this can work, but I think going into, you know, T1, this is a team that plays against this early game aggressive style really well, and you really have to perform at a high level, and unfortunately you're just not getting those high level performances at right now out of your good players, out of the players you need to get them out of. Zeka's going to get another dud of the game here. He's really not been particularly effective in this series. I didn't think he was great in game number 1. He really was not good in games 2 or 3. Like, he has not been up to his standard throughout this regular season so far. He dominated this series when they played earlier on in the playoffs, but as we know, Zeka can be rather volatile. I love him. He's probably the biggest channel darling I have on this channel, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend like he's not going to have a bad game every once in a while. The reason that I trusted HLE so much is because they have the tools to be able to play without Zeka if necessary, but this team's not really investing all that much into Viper, and I think that that's a bit of a mistake. I think you need to get, you know, champions like this Jinx ahead if you're going to index super heavily into this draft surrounding the top side with Sejuani enabling your two melee carries in the Gwen and the Yone. Then I think you're leaving Viper out to dry a little bit, and it's just not necessarily the direction I would personally be going in with how the games specifically have gone. I think this is a draft that would have worked very well for HLE in the regular season, but it just doesn't seem seem to be working against T1 right now, and so you need to be willing to adapt. But Doran has been the worst of the two top laners. He was also very bad in game number 1, even in their win, and it's not like he's been better in games 2 and 3. Zeus has really taken over a lot of these games. Delight really didn't look good in this game on a champion in Thresh that I think is underpowered and certainly overvalued right now in the meta. I just don't think HLE had a very good identity for what they wanted to go into game number 3 with, and I think they got punished really heavily for it, and now they are one game away from being eliminated. They were very close to making the finals on their own against Gen G from the winners bracket. They destroyed T1 the last time these two teams played. This would be a catastrophic error if they essentially get 4-0'd by T1 with how game number 1 ended up going. Can they stay alive? Can they win this game 4? Can they push this to a game 5? Can they prove that it wasn't just outside interference that ended up, keeping them alive in this playoff run? Or can T1 show that, no, we were actually always the second best team in the league by a large margin, and as soon as the game started mattering a lot more, that's when we were going to step up and decide to really push it forward? Well, we're going to find out, of course, here in game number 4, because the winner of game number 4 was T1. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to win this series 3-1, and they are going to be heading to the finals for their, 5th or 6th or something like that, finals in a row against each other. It might even be more than that. That's all I can remember off the top of my head. It's certainly been at least 4 to 5, at absolute minimum in a row. Not that that is the worst thing in the world if they're the two best teams, and they're the two best teams, and T1 definitely coming back and, really showing that they can avenge that loss against Hanwha, that they can rebound in the lower bracket. It's very, very good for them. They have a lot of confidence coming out of this series, but for Hanwha, you've got to be a bit disappointed. You looked really good coming into this series, and just, you weren't able to carry that momentum into something where you absolutely just needed to win. You needed to go out there and prove that your mechanics could take you through, and I think a lot of players really ended up underperforming in this series for them. I'm not really sure what that means going forward for them. It'll be interesting to see kind of what their idea is moving into Summer Split. Obviously, you don't make changes to this roster. You have to run back this group of 5 players. They are certainly good enough for you to, at the very minimum, make a difference at Worlds. Maybe even win the LCK or do something at Worlds, if you're really, really lucky, if you get some development. But, I'm not going to freak out about Hanwha Life. This is more of a good thing for T1. This was a really good series, honestly, kind of a 4-0 for them. They were the better team in game number 1. They just threw it away, and then, they were the better team in games 2, 3, and 4 as well. So credit to them. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole for me is going to go to Zeus in the top lane. A pretty big series, I would say, for him to step up. He has historically been a little bit underwhelming, I would say, generally against Doran. That's kind of been the perception, and it's been correct, I would say, throughout his career. But talk about a pretty good time for that to be a little bit of a changed subject for you. A Vayne pick here on R5 in game number 4, and this is really one of the first times that we've seen Vayne actively work across the playoffs so far. We've seen teams pull it out as a counter pick to things like the Rek'Sai that want to be a bit more aggressive in the early game. Vayne can dominate lane a little bit easier, and obviously she does scale. She can still team fight very effectively, and I think Zeus is just really active in that way. They're going to be willing to play through him. They're going to be willing to play around him, and that means the Vayne's going to be in a really positive spot. She's not going to be left on an island and just kind of exposed to a lot of more aggressive plays from the enemy jungle. She actually is going to have assistance, and that really is the only way that you're going to get a champion like this to work. So credit to Zeus. His mechanics were absolutely on point, and honestly, he was terrific today. There's a reason he's going to get player of the series, and that's because he was, in my opinion, clearly the biggest asset T1 had. But Faker was also, of course, in that conversation. We talked about it in the pre-series. Really, it was the solo lanes that needed to step up for T1. They were the lanes that you would expect to have an advantage in terms of the on-paper matchup. Faker and Zeka are both good players, but Faker should theoretically be better, and he was. Same thing with Zeus and Doran. Zeus was way better in the regular season, so I'm glad to see, I should say, that had carried over. But for the solo laners to step up, I think was very important. Faker on Taliyah is just super hard to stop. He is such a good macro threat and a big macro presence that even if you do have somebody in a side lane that could become a problem, which HLE doesn't with this team comp, but even if you theoretically did, Faker would be in a great position to be able to stop it with the amount of resources that he got in the mid game and his ability to team fight late game. You just trust him a lot in those circumstances, and so I really like this draft idea. I think it works around the Vayne. Owner had a really good series. I think he was just straight up better than Peanut. I don't even think Peanut was all that bad. He probably had his worst game of the series here on the Nocturne, but we'll get to that in a second. Owner just was very good. This was one of the few series that he's had this year where I actively saw him being proactive and playing around his laners. Now, he still does rely a bit on those laners winning. For him to have jungle advantages, it's something that I've always criticized. I'm not sure Owner would do as well on a team that wasn't T1, but he isn't on a team that isn't T1. He is on T1, a team where the laners are going to win relatively frequently, and I think he does a good job of capitalizing in those circumstances where they do that. Guma and Keria were fine. Guma with yet another massive objective steal on Varus. It just feels ridiculous. It feels like comical at this point how this ends up going, but it just kind of is what it is. Guma's better at smiting than 90% of LCK junglers or any jungler in the world, quite frankly. He's just ridiculous in that phase, and Keria was pretty good in this series. Kind of irrelevant, I would say, overall in the grand scheme of things, but Zeus, Faker, and Owner to a lesser extent were definitely the driving forces for T1, and they're the reason they're going to be moving into the finals. Once again, they are going to have an opportunity to finally avenge some of these finals losses that they have been receiving. It's not going to be easy. They're facing arguably the best team in the world in the finals, but they've given themselves that opportunity. For Hanwha Life, they are not going to get the chance to avenge their loss in winners finals to Gen.G with their elimination here. They are done. They are not going to MSI. T1 will be taking that spot instead, and honestly, they needed to play better. It is their fault that they're not going to MSI. This is not some weird bad meta read, although I don't think that the Yone plus the Sejuani was necessarily doing them any favors. I think this was just them not being good enough. I think T1 just clearly outplayed them today, and that's going to happen every once in a while. Again, I think these two teams are relatively evenly matched, and so on any given day, I think either of these teams could really show up and just kind of dominate the matchup, and that's what we saw today, unfortunately, against HLE. Dud of the game in game number 4 is going to go to Doran. He felt pretty outclassed in this series. I think Doran and Zeka are definitely the two that people are going to point to as kind of the biggest negatives, and I agree. They were not good enough in this series. There really is no other way to say it. But Doran, to me, was the biggest problem here in Game 4. I think a lot of fingers are going to be pointed at the mid gap, and I agree. Game 3 in particular, but Game 2 to an extent as well, especially because Zeka had that horrible positioning mistake at the end. You could call it a mid gap. I don't think you can say that as much here for Game number 4. The Azir was very relevant. He didn't really make any major errors. He just wasn't a dominant threat on that side of the map in the same way that like the Vayne or the Varus were on the other side. Perhaps he should have been able to keep up a bit more in terms of the damage, but his team was also in a much more negative state. I'm not blaming Game 4 on Zeka. I'm blaming it on the top side. Doran allowed this Vayne to get out of control way too quickly, and they really had no answer for this. R5 Vayne completely obliterates their comp. They really don't have a way to shut down these auto attacks and to stop her from just taking over these fights. And so Doran losing so much so early on, it's just an absolute disaster, I would say, for a team that just couldn't survive that. They couldn't really survive him losing so hard here in game number 4. But Peanut also, I think, had a really rough game on the Nocturne. I think it was by far his weakest of the series. He was pretty good, I would think, throughout the middle of this series, trying his best to keep up with Owner in terms of early game pressure. But again, when your lanes are losing, it's actually very difficult to play out these games. Big shocker, big surprise. But I think the Nocturne's just a pick that when it loses, it's going to look bad. I'm not really a huge fan of Nocturne in Pro. As anybody who follows the channel knows, I just don't think it affects nearly as much as maybe you would like it to in these circumstances. But at the end of the day, I think it's more up to gameplay, and Peanut probably had his worst game of the series here in game 4. Viper and Delight were generally fine. I think they were by far the strongest part of this team throughout this series, but I mean, what is this bot lane going to do to salvage it? First of all, HLE didn't play through bot lane in any of the games, maybe with the exception of game 1, but even then, it was more so just allowing Varus to take over some of these fights to quote-unquote save the game for them, and that's great. Like, I'm glad you were, able to do that, but not investing a lot of resources into this bot lane in the early game, I think, was kind of their downfall. Understanding the need to adapt. I've talked about it a lot over the course of this year. I really like the idea of investing so much into the mid lane for HLE because Viper and Delight are going to be good in the isolated 2v2, but when things aren't working on the top side, when things aren't working in the mid lane, you have to be willing to say, okay, it's not working, we gotta go to the bot lane. We have to start going to the lower part of the map, and HLE just didn't make that adjustment, and I think it really hurt them in this series. Overall, they just weren't the better team in this series, and I think that was abundantly clear. Again, I don't think they need to make changes for summer. They are clearly a top 3 team, and I would think it would take a Herculean effort for them not to make Worlds, but I think they are going to feel a little bit let down by themselves that they weren't able to make MSI. But congratulations to T1. They have now officially qualified for the LCK finals. They've officially qualified for MSI. This team has its problems. They certainly aren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I feel like maybe they're just taking it low for a bit of this year, but they do not look nearly as good as they did last year. There are clearly some things I think they need to clean up, but there's no reason this team can't figure it out. They won Worlds last year for a reason. This could still be one of the best teams in the world. I think I just need to see a little bit more in terms of what they've shown in 2024 to truly believe that right now. But that's going to do it for our analysis of the semifinals. It's time to get into my preview for the LCK finals here, a determination of which team will be going to MSI as the #1 seed, and more importantly, in my opinion, who will be your 2024 Spring Split LCK champions. Is it going to be the #1 seeded Gen.G or the #2 seeded T1? Both coming from very different places in terms of, just where they have finished in the regular season, how their playoffs have gone so far. T1, of course, having to go through the lower bracket, losing losing to Hanwha Life in their first series, having essentially to play the entirety of these 2 series without that extra life. Gen G not having that problem. They have dominated their playoff run up until this point. They struggled a bit with DK, and it's not like the HLE series was a pushover, but they have been the better team in both of the series that they played. It's never really felt like they weren't the better team, and they're going to be big favorites going into this, not only in terms of the consensus, but for me as well. I think a lot of people are going to put a lot of faith in T1, but I think there's just reasons to believe that they should be considered the underdog. And I also want to reiterate that that's not necessarily a bad thing for T1. Them not having the expectations of being expected to win a series like this could potentially be good for them in the long run. But let's go ahead and talk about this lane-by-lane matchup, starting with Keen versus Zeus in the top lane, the 2 best top laners in the LCK going head-to-head. This is really the intriguing matchup for me. I think if Zeus can take over in the same way that he did against HLE in this previous semifinal series that we just talked about, I think T1's actually in a very interesting position. The problem is that Keen is not Doran. Doran has bad series every once in a while. There are going to be some games where he's just not relevant, where he's not good. Keen doesn't really have that. He can play a variety of different champions. He can split push you on TF. He can be a primary tank on things like Udyr or Cassante. He can engage on bruisers. He can be more aggressive on Renekton. We know that he can do basically whatever, strong side, weak side. He's a very volatile and versatile player, but that also means that this top lane matchup could go in favor of either of these teams. It's really hard to sit here and say that one player is definitely better than the other with how they have played over the course of this year. I gave Zeus my first team All-Pro nod, so I would say very slightly I would favor him, but I certainly do not think that it is like set in stone. Zeus was more volatile over the course of the regular season. He's going to have better great games and worse bad games, I think, than someone like Keen will, so it'll be interesting. Then you get to the jungle matchup. You know, I would very confidently say this is in favor of Gen G if it weren't for how well Owner had been playing in the playoffs. I think he's certainly been better than what he was in the regular season, where he just kind of was a guy alongside the rest of this team. I think that his performances have increased quite a bit going into the playoffs. That being said, Canyon has clear-cut been the best jungler in the LCK over the course of this year. I don't even think that's really disputable in any way, shape, or form. He has been excellent for Gen G. Him and Chovy have formed a ridiculously potent and dangerous mid-jungle duo, and I think for that reason, you have to consider Canyon the better of these 2 junglers at the current moment, but Owner has been playing well, and especially if these lanes end up going in a better way, I think that Owner could have a bigger impact on the series, but I think that has more to do with the other lanes than it does the jungle matchup. The most important one, of course, being the mid lane. Chovy, Faker, I mean, the most classic LCK finals matchup we can get at this point. They have played each other over and over and over again in these big moments, and Chovy almost always comes out on top, but Faker knows that, and it's not like Faker underperforms in these big moments. This could absolutely be the time for him to step up. They were number 1 and number 2 in my MVP voting in the regular season. Chovy pretty obviously got the nod. He was the unanimous MVP for a reason. I don't even think that was really all that up for debate. It's not like he has underperformed at all in the playoffs. He almost single-handedly pushed Gen G over Hanwha Life in that series in winners finals. He was, I mean, that's truly one of the best of 5s I've ever seen a mid laner play. Like, he was that good, but it's Faker. It's not like we're expecting him to get blown back or anything like that. I think the mid lane is going to be a blast to watch. I hope both of these players come at their absolute best, because I think if they do, then these games are going to be really fun. But Pays and Lehen's taking on Guma and Keria. I think this is one of the lesser important of the lanes, not because I think that these players are bad by any means. I think obviously, you know, Lehen's and Carry are both very active as supports. Pays and Guma are both very reliable as late game carries. However, I just don't think either of these teams invest all that much into the bottom side of the map. Bot lanes for both of these teams feel more like expendable late game resources rather than like driving forces, like for a team like Hanwha Life or even a team like DK that play a lot through their bot lane. These teams don't really do that. Pays and Lehen's, specifically Pays, are more of an extension of what the rest of the team is doing at the time. Same thing with Guma. He's really relied upon to be that more stable presence on the bot side. I wouldn't expect bot lane to matter entirely, except for the fact that Lehen's and Keria could potentially roam a lot. I don't think the 2v2 is going to matter all that much in terms of the grand scheme of things, but if Lehen's can get out on the map and be more of a macro proactive presence alongside Canyon, I think that could be very in favor of Gen G. If Keria can pick something weird and just dominate this 2v2 while Lehen's is gone and moving around the map, then I think that could be very in favor of T1. I think that there are opportunities for this bot lane to matter, but I think generally I'm looking at the jungle mid, I'm looking at top lane as the lanes that I would really expect to kind of dictate which direction this series ends up going in. Where do I have the favoritism? Well, I have it towards Gen G slightly. As you can see from the percentile graph on screen, I think that they should be the better team. My prediction in this series would be Gen G 3-1, Gen G 3-0. I think they should go in as pretty big favorites. T1 has a lot of things they need to work out, and clearly this roster has always struggled a bit against Gen G. You know, Chovy is a player that I would expect to continue to play well in the finals. Canyon, it's not like he's bad in big moments. Like, I think there's a reason to be excited about Gen G here, but if T1 wins, I'm not going to be stunned. These are the two best teams in the LCK right now. They're both going to MSI for a reason, and I think either of them could theoretically take it. I just think, for me, at least going into it, T1 has to be viewed as the underdogs. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK semifinals of the spring playoffs overview and analysis video. We're down to the final two, Gen G, T1, two teams that have qualified for MSI, that have qualified to go international, playing off against each other for the right to be crowned the LCK champion. This is a familiar story, but will the result be different? Will Gen G continue their path of dominance domestically, winning what I believe is their 4th straight domestic title, or will T1 finally be able to conquer their demons and take down the team that they have not been able to take down in the last few years? It's going to be interesting either way. Would love to know your thoughts and opinions on what is going to happen down in the comment section below. If you did enjoy the video, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK, we post about the LPL, the LEC. Those playoffs are going on right now. In fact, the LEC, as soon as the series wraps up, that's going on right now, I will be posting about that series later today, so hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.